want to share with you a little bit why this is such an important topic to me. That you come to the same place that I have. And I don't want to force you into anything, but my hope is for all of us as we go through these stories of the Old Testament, that you will have the same revelation from God that I did. And that revelation is that these stories are real. These are real events. These are historical events in our past that actually happened and actually shaped the world that we live in. My freshman year of college, I was attending a small junior college, and there was this professor, and the class was called World Geography. So I went in there naively thinking I was going to learn about countries and capitals and GDP and things like that. Well, the class turned out to be two things. It was a class on evolution, and it was also a class on how stupid Christians are. The first day of the class, he asked the class, how many of you are Christians? And I think out of a group of about 40 of us, maybe 5 of us raised our hands. And he said, well, if any of you survive this class, it'll be a miracle because none of you are smart enough to walk into the door. Because we believed in Jesus and we believed in God. And so he made a point every single class to belittle us and to make fun of us. He would call us out in class and do everything he could. And the problem is that this guy had a PhD and a chip on his shoulder because he would tell us that he gave up a job at Harvard to work at our junior college in the middle of southern Missouri. We all knew that wasn't true. And so he had this chip on his shoulder about how he wanted to prove how much smarter he was than the rest of us, which he should have been because he'd gone to school for about 25 years. So through this class, my faith began to waver. I had gone through some difficult things personally in the months leading up to this class. I had gone through a very difficult breakup from a 2-year relationship, and I just found myself in this place of being led by my emotions, and my emotions were leading me a little bit from God because I felt betrayed and frustrated, and I was confused. And so I got into this class, and I started hearing these things from this professor, and he gave me these answers to questions that I had had and things that I had just taken for granted growing up, hearing the stories of the Bible and in Sunday school. He began to dismantle the things that I believed and gave really convincing arguments for these things. And then there was something about that was so attractive about how he came across as this enlightened intellectual person. And I think everybody that goes to college that's sitting in the classroom, you want to feel like you belong to that. You want to feel like you too are enlightened and you too are intellectual and you too are capable of seeing through the nonsense of the world because you're learning how to think for yourself. And so toward the end of this semester, I was having a real crisis of faith. And I remember there was one night I was sitting in my apartment in my bedroom, and I had put my books away because I was reading my Bible, and I'm reading the Bible, and every other word I'm thinking, this isn't even real. Why am I wasting my time? This stuff isn't, this is just stories made up by man to try to explain the human condition. Why am I wasting my time with all of this? And so I put my Bible down, and I just had tears in my eyes. And I was so frustrated, and I felt so conflicted. And I remember I just was like, all right, God, if you're real, if the Bible is true and if you're real, then I'm going to need some evidence. Because I'm getting all kinds of evidence from my class, and I'm not getting anything from you except for the stories in the Bible. I'm going to need you to show me that you are believable. Well, nothing happened immediately. There was no writing on the wall. There was no glow in the room. I wasn't transported into another place or another dimension. But what did happen was over the next couple of weeks, I kept hearing just over and over and over and over again that about all these resources that were available. I'd hear it on TV, I'd hear it in church, I'd hear it, I'd be looking on the internet and like ads would pop up just out of nowhere about creation and the flood and the fact that there was actually evidence that opposed evolution, and there was actually information that was available out there that would help explain the truth of the Bible. And I'm not making this up. It was just like all of a sudden I was surrounded by information that I needed. And so I started to study. And I took about 2.5 years of my life, and I annoyed everybody around me because all I wanted to talk about all the time was creation, 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 and all of the science behind it. And I was also kind of an academic snob, which means I did not, and I still to this day, I don't really like getting information with people that just kind of if it was just preachers and theologians that taught these things, or if there were actually any scientists who actually believed in God, because I was being taught that no scientist in the world actually believed in Jesus, let alone the Bible. That's what I was hearing on a daily basis in the classroom. And so I started doing research, and the first book that I read on this topic was a book by Lee Strobel called Case for a Creator. And that book rocked my world because everybody in that book has PhD and sometimes 12 other letters behind their name. And all of a sudden, I was coming into contact with these extremely intelligent, well-educated individuals who not only believed in God, but believed in Jesus, but not only believed in Jesus, but actually believed that the events described within the Scripture were not only historical, but also reliable. And it excited me because now I did not have to be ashamed of the things that I believed. Now I was learning that there's actually evidence to back up, and not just evidence that you read about in the Bible, but evidence that actual scientists believe in. So this morning, I want to lay out for you some of the evidence surrounding the flood. And I want to start out by saying that Christians and Jews are not the only people in the world that believe in the flood. There are literally thousands of flood legends from every culture in the world. You go anywhere in the world and you go back and you study history from any culture in the world, and there will be a flood legend, a story of a great flood. And as you begin to compare and contrast these different stories, it becomes amazing on how many points of agreement they have. Many of these stories reference a great flood that the god or the gods or, just somebody sent to destroy all earth because of man's sin, and that there were these 8 people that got on a boat with 2 of every type of animal and saved the world. Now, that would be coincidence possibly if it was a couple of different cultures that believe this. Maybe 1 or 2 or 3 civilizations. Maybe you could point at it and say what many historians say is that the Bible actually got its story from the Epic of Gilgamesh. I don't know if you're familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was from the Mesopotamian Empire from about 5,000 years ago. And so they say, well, see, Christians and Jews, they just borrowed this story from another civilization. But the problem with that is that these civilizations were separated by thousands of miles and by huge bodies of water. You can go to South America, you can go to Australia, you can go to Africa, you can go to Asia, you can go to North America, and all of these continents have civilizations and cultures that all have similar stories of a flood. Why? Because it happened, right? I mean, that in itself is good evidence to me that if people have been separated by thousands of miles and by years and years and years, and they've never had any contact with each other, but they all have the same similar story, all of a sudden this idea of a global flood begins to make sense. And the global flood is also an important part of this story because you will hear many pastors today that will say things like, oh yes, there was a flood, but it was a local flood. And by that, they mean that typically it's this story that there were people living in the basin that is now the Black Sea. And there was a village there because they found villages underneath the Black Sea. And that people were living there, and then at the end of the last ice age, the melt from the glaciers began to raise the raise the level of the Black Sea, and did it in a very quick fashion to where people actually had to leave because of a damaging flood. And so people took that story and they made the biblical story. The problem with that is that there's stories about the flood everywhere. So unless there were about 5,000 local floods where 2 people were told by God to get onto a boat with 2 of every type of animal, all of a sudden you start running into a problem where there's way too much coincidence. So the foundation for much of the belief that the flood could not be historical or scientifically accurate is an idea that was developed in the 1700s, and it is known as uniformitarianism. Anybody want to spell that? It's actually called uniformitarian geology. And I'm just using these terms so you're impressed by me, honestly. I looked this up last night on the internet, and I was like, how can I make them respect me? If the suit isn't enough, right? 2 weeks in a row. I can't wait till the summer. You're all wearing flip-flops. So uniformitarian geology is this idea, and it's summarized like this. The present is the key to the past. So the idea behind uniformitarianism is that the processes that we see in play today, erosion by wind, erosion by water, the seasons, the way that the winds come, the way that weather happens, the way that we see things shaped today is the way that it's always been. So if you extrapolate what you watch today and you go back in time, thousands, or in the case of most science, millions or billions of years, these are the processes by which you're going to see everything take shape. So when you go to the Grand Canyon, you go on a tour, and they tell you, look at this Grand Canyon. It's over a mile deep in some places, and the Grand Canyon is an amazing place. But they'll take you there, and they'll say, you see all of these layers. How many of you guys have ever seen layer strata in rock somewhere? Maybe you've seen pictures of the Grand Canyon. You see all these definite layers laid out. And they'll say, isn't this amazing that over millions and millions and millions of years, the river here actually cut through the Grand Canyon, and over time, this river, which is the Colorado River, which is at a mile to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, that over millions of years, it cut through the geologic layers, and it has formed this canyon. And they'll say, this is how all canyons are formed, this is how all rock formations are formed, but there's a problem with this. You see, the limestone that much of the Grand Canyon is made out of, if you study the layers, you'll see one of two things. There's either marks of extremely rapid erosion between the layers, or there's no erosion between the layers. The problem with either one of those is that if these layers are being laid down, or if these layers had been laid down and then cut through over millions and millions of years, erosion, you would not see evidence of rapid erosion, or you would not see evidence of no erosion. There would just be this slow, steady, gradual erosion that we experience today. The other problem with this idea that these layers of rock were formed slowly over millions and millions of years is that there are places that you can go all over the world and you will find fossilized animals, or in some cases fossilized trees, standing up through 20, 30, 40 of these sedimentary layers. So we have one of two options here. Either those layers were laid down in a very, very quick manner, or that tree stood up in that place for 75 million years while the dirt formed around it. That's not something that we observe very often today. The other problem with this argument, though, if you're arguing from a biblical perspective, is that it's very hard to argue against. Because they'll always come back to you and they'll say, well, you don't have evidence that it didn't happen that way. Because none of us have been around for 14 billion years. So that's a really hard argument to come against, because you have no way of saying, well, you're right, I don't have evidence that it didn't happen this way, but here's the flip side of that argument. They don't have evidence that it did either. So much of science and so much of these theories are based on assumption. And they're based on good observations, but they come to bad conclusions. Watching erosion at the rate that it happens is a very good observation. It's something that we should do. It's something that we should pay attention to. It's something that science should endeavor to figure out and to learn how erosion occurs. But to say that that is the way it has always happened, and that is the definitive way of how we explain everything in the past, then we run into some problems. Because the sedimentary layers, there's this process called hydrologic sorting. Again, another big word, okay? Hydrologic sorting. So if you take a whole bunch of material, right? So you take dirt and sticks and rocks and bones and fossils and not fossils, but skeletons and all these things, and you put them in a huge tub of water and you begin to slosh it around. You know what's going to happen? That water is naturally, because of hydrologic sorting, is going to settle down in perfect layers. This is a known fact of science. Remember what we've talked about before. Science is anything that you can test, observe, or repeat. Well, you can go do this experiment at home. If you get a big jar and you fill it up with rocks and sticks and debris, and you shake it up and you allow that water to settle, it will settle down into layers. So the biblical model, the biblical theory of how all the layers around the world have gotten into place and gotten into position is through this process of hydrologic sorting. So the theory would go that at one time that there was a very large flood that occurred all over the entire world, that caused all kinds of dirt and debris and rock to shake up and be loosened, and then over a slow period of time, that all settled down into layers and slowly solidified into rock formations. Well, it just so happens that the Bible actually talks about a flood like that. The Bible actually talks about that there was a worldwide global catastrophe that actually broke up the very crust of the earth, sent layers of soil all over the world. And that's another thing that we find interesting, is that we find soil, the same type of soil that originated in one place, we find it spread out all over the world, laid down in the weirdest of places. One of my favorite evidences for a global flood is that if you go to the top of some of the highest mountains in the Himalayas, you know what you find at the top 3,000 feet? You find fossilized fish, and you find fossilized seashells all over the Himalayan mountains. In fact, I think Mount Everest, don't quote me on that, but I think Mount Everest itself has fossilized seashells the top 3,000 feet of that mountain. Explain to me how that works. Explain to me how you find seashells at the top of the highest mountain in the world, mountains that they tell us are hundreds of millions of years old and are still continuing to grow every year. Did you know that those mountains are still growing higher by inches every year? So how do the tallest mountains in the world get seashells on them? Unless at one time they were covered by water. So a big question that Christians get asked, or that people that believe in the Bible get asked about the flood, is how in the world do you fit every type of species in the world on a boat? All right? Now the ark was big. By the standards that we understand, the ark would have been somewhere just over 500 feet long, so it was 300 cubits. So it was a little over 500 feet long. It was about 3/4 the size of the Titanic. It was about 80 to 100 feet wide, and it was about 50 feet tall. So it had 3 different decks. So even in a boat that size, how in the world would you fit all of the different species onto the ark? Because it says you had to take 2 of every type of animal and 7 of the clean ones. So how in the world do you do that? That is a big boat, but that is millions and millions and millions of species. Well, the problem with the idea of species is that the Bible doesn't tell us to take 2 of every kind of species. It says to take 2 of every kind of animal. In the animal classification system, it goes kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You guys remember that from biology class? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So the idea is that the kind would be more around the level of family. So look at dogs. There are over 200 species of dogs living right now, okay? But we know, and scientists unanimously agree on this, that all the dogs that we have in the world today came from, you know what it came from? A dog. It came from a dog. More than likely wolves somewhere thousands of years ago. Now, we kind of laugh at that and we joke about that, but the reality of it is, and they've shown this, over the last 300 years, the amount of species of dogs have increased dramatically. In fact, the majority of species of dogs have actually occurred within the last 100 years of human history, because human beings are breeding them and we are trying to create new breeds all the time. So for a very, very, very long time, you had a select number of dogs, or a select species of dogs. But if you can get every type of species of dog from one type of animal, from one type of dog, isn't that the type that you take on the boat? Because you don't need all 200 species. You don't need 400 dogs on the boat. You need 2 dogs. And those two dogs over time are going to have, within their genetic structure, the genetic ability to have variation within the kind. Now, some people will claim and say, well, see, that's evolution. You're right. It's microevolution. It's evolution on a small scale based on survival of the fittest and adaptation, but it is not one type of animal becoming another type of animal. It is a dog. It is genus. It is within that same family of animal. The other idea behind this is that why would you take fully grown animals onto the ark? I mean, yeah, I can understand this whenever you walk into the zoo and you see a 12,000-pound elephant, you see a 17-foot tall giraffe, and you're like, you get too many of these type of animals on the boat and you're going to start having trouble. Well, that's absolutely true, but why would you take fully grown animals? Wouldn't it make more sense to take young animals that are going to have a much longer lifespan in which to produce offspring? They're probably going to be more fertile, and babies sleep more, eat less, and poop a whole lot less, right? Not less, but smaller packages. So you're not going to take fully grown animals onto the ark. You're going to take smaller animals, and you're going to put them on a boat. In fact, there's actually the Creation Museum down in Tennessee. They've actually built a replica, like a foot-by-foot model of the ark down there. I can't wait to go see this thing. And its actual size, and they actually show you how they could fit 7,000 kinds of animals, because if you break down all the species into kinds, you come to about 7,000 kinds of animals that you could have. And it shows very nicely how you could fit them all on a boat. Now, scientists make fun of this all day long. The problem is that none of them are actually going and looking at it. But here's the other thing. I can't scientifically prove God to you. I can use science to show you the probability of God, but I also can't use science to prove evolution to you. I can use observations to show a probability toward evolution, but both of us are arriving at our understanding based on a measure of faith. I would never claim that there was not miracle involved in what occurred on the ark. I think personally it's very likely that God may have caused many of those animals to go into a state of hibernation. I mean, we observe all kinds of animals today that hibernate under times of stress or during different seasons. So wouldn't it make sense that by God's miraculous power that He would allow these animals to sleep more than normal? Then they're going to eat a whole lot less, they're going to poop a whole lot less, and they're going to require a whole lot less time and care and attention. But see, once you begin to break down a story like the flood into these ways, all of a sudden you begin to see how it becomes possible. But I can't prove it to you scientifically. I agree that it takes a measure of faith, and I am relying on a certain amount of miracle, but I also believe that God created the universe. So if I believe in a God who created the universe, putting a bunch of animals on a boat for a year, that's not really that difficult. I believe in a much larger miracle and the creation of everything. And so therefore, I believe everything else in the Bible becomes not only possible, but probable if the God who created all things is behind it. All right, so another one of the big problems that people have with the ark, and I just heard this. Did any of you watch the debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, the science guy? Like one of you sat through that nonsense? Okay. I really liked Bill Nye growing up. I no longer think he and I would sit well in a room together because of this. He thinks all Christians are complete idiots. And if you read some of the things that he says about Christians, all of a sudden it becomes very, very volatile. If you are a Christian young person, and we have several Augie students here this morning, awesome to have you guys. Thank you for coming and being a part of the church. Thank you. And I'll also say this, if I'm not convincing you this morning, I'm okay with that. What I'm not okay with is closed-mindedness, where you say, I already know the truth, so I don't care about what you have to say. Let's have an open dialogue and let's discuss these things, right? Because I'm open to being proven wrong. I don't like to admit it. You can ask my wife, but I'm open to it occasionally. So one of the big problems, and this is one of the things that Bill Nye brought up, he said, well, the biggest boat ever constructed of wood occurred in the 1800s. And he's right about this. It was a 6-masted boat, which means it had 6 sails on this boat, right? And it was 2/3 the size of what the ark would have been. And when they built this big wooden boat, it was master shipbuilders from all over Europe. They came together, they built this boat, they took it out in the ocean, and it sank. Because it was a 6-masted boat, and out in the waters, it would twist and it would turn, and it began to leak, and all of a sudden, too much water, and it sank. So many people look at that and they say, see, the biggest wooden boat built in modern times sank. So how could 8 people build a boat that was bigger than this and it survived the flood? Well, there's a couple of problems. Number one, you're assuming that Noah and his family were idiots. I think that's a bad assumption. I personally believe that science and technology before the flood was probably quite impressive. I mean, do we not have structures that were built during that time from thousands of years ago that we cannot duplicate today? We have no idea how they built the pyramids. We have no idea how they did Stonehenge. We have no idea how they moved 200,000 ton rocks from one place to another when none of those rocks are nowhere within 50 or 60 miles. So I think that at some point in the past that there were some really smart people. We also fail to take into consideration that Noah did this for 100 years of his life. God called him to build the boat at 500. The flood didn't come until 600. You know what? I'm pretty lousy with a hammer and nails, but you give me 100 years and I can build something, right? But it would sink. The other thing is the Bible does not tell us at all that Noah didn't hire people to help him. So there's a lot of assumptions that are being made, and here's the other problem. The ark didn't have sails on it. Noah wasn't trying to go anywhere. He was trying to survive. So if you take the sails off the boat, much of the twisting and turning that caused the leaking of that boat goes away because you just have a solid object that's floating in the water. And we don't even really know what it looks like. Most modern depictions of the ark are of this square block-looking thing. We don't know what it looked like. We have no idea other than its dimensions. But I could give you the height, width, and depth of my car, but I don't drive a square. My car isn't designed like a square. It's designed so that it's able to go through air and wind and rain the best. I'm assuming that somebody who's using the knowledge and skill set that God has given him probably knows how to build a boat a little bit better than just a big block to float in the water. So the flood itself. One of the issues that comes up again and again and again are all throughout the world, why do we find the same type, the same kind of fossils together? So now once in a while you will find different fossils from different age groups in different places, but by and large, I acknowledge this and the scientific community acknowledge this, people that believe in the Bible acknowledge this, that by and large you will find the same kinds of animals and the same layers of rocks. And that's why scientists have concluded that many times they can't, radiocarbon dating is a joke, by the way. If you ever research radiocarbon dating, they radiocarbon date things that have just died and they come up as hundreds of thousands of years old. So it's not an exact science. Much of the way that we date anything is by what rock strata it's found in. So I want to ask you a question. So if you date a fossil by the strata of rock it's found in, and then you date the strata of rock by which fossil it's found in, it's circular reasoning. But so much of this is based on this circular reasoning, where they date things based off an assumption that they have made from uniformitarian geology. So why in the world do you find all of these animals in these different layers together? Well, again, we go back to that concept of hydrologic sorting. But they'll say, well, surely some animals would have tried to swim up to the top, and you would have had some animals living on the top. Well, this is assuming that the floodwaters were like filling up your bathtub, right? The flood was not this simple, nice little experience where people were like, uh-oh, uh-oh, uh-oh. The Bible tells us that the fountains of the deep broke forth. The chaos and destruction and mayhem and just absolute craziness that was going on, none of us have any ideas. Because the belief from people that study the scriptures and also study science is that when the fountains of the deep broke open, you had earthquakes going on around the world. You had volcanoes that were exploding all over the place, and the earth literally went into destruction mode. So the waters that were coming, they estimate that some of the tsunamis would have been over a mile high, right? So why didn't the animals just swim to the top? There's no swimming with a 1,000-foot tsunami. I don't care how good you are at surfing, you're not surfing that wave. Things died quickly. It was not like this idea that some people just got a raft and survived the flood, and that's why it took a year. No, the reason it took a year was because the water was completely covering the entire face of the earth. But that's another thing. We have to be careful not to buy into this same assumption that other people are buying into. To believe that the earth looked exactly the same way before the flood as it does today would be to make a bad assumption. Now, we have no evidence of that contrary except for what the Bible tells us. But we do have some observations that we can make from science. You see, there are fault lines all around the planet. Have you guys ever heard of fault lines? Have you ever heard of plate tectonics? Well, it could be that when the fountains of the deep broke open, that all of this water that was reservoired beneath the crust of the earth, which the Bible talks about, when it came breaking out of the surface, probably shooting miles into the air and then raining down for a period of 40 days and 40 nights, that it caused plate tectonics. That it caused plates to begin to ram into each other. And all of a sudden, I do believe that there would have been mountains and things before the flood, but I don't think the world landscape looked anything like it did. I think it was such a cataclysmic event that all of a sudden mountain ranges were forming, that huge valleys were forming, that the way that the world looked before was completely transformed over that year's time by the flood. And I think there's good evidence for this. And I think it begins to help us to understand why the world that we live in is in such a chaotic place today. In fact, you can go all around the world and you can discover where the crustal plates of the planet are sliding against each other. Well, it makes a lot of sense that that is happening in such a way, in such a violent way, if the world was broken apart at the time of the flood. What about the Ice Age? This is a thing that people love to ask about. What about the Ice Age? I genuinely believe that the flood caused the Ice Age. I believe in the Ice Age. There's no getting around it. We know that there was ice hundreds of miles, or at least a mile thick in Kansas City at one point, and it created these huge gouges in the earth. So there's no doubt at all about whether or not there was an Ice Age. There's just a great amount of question of when the Ice Age actually occurred and what caused it. So if you study history going back, and you can actually grab Amber. Have you guys ever seen the movie Jurassic Park, the original one, the cool one from '93? That was such a great movie. Well, in that movie, they did some very bad science, and they showed them sticking a needle into a 75-million-year-old mosquito and drawing blood and then creating dinosaurs from that. That can't happen. That would be so cool, though, right? I want a Brachiosaurus to ride to work. Like that's going to be my animal. But you can actually get amber fossils, and you can actually study what the environment was in the past from those amber fossils. And we know that from many of the fossils that have been collected at some point in world history, that the earth had about 50% more oxygen in it, like the atmosphere did. And we know this also because we find fossilized dragonflies with 6-foot wingspans. I don't even know what the spiders looked like back then, because there isn't a gun big enough for that. That's when you get swatted by the fly. And we find fossilized vegetation of leaves that are like 4 or 5 feet wide. Well, how in the world could this type of flora and fauna have existed? Well, the conditions of the atmosphere would have been very different. And the flood theory, believes in this also, and it believes that the conditions of the planet, the conditions of the atmosphere, the conditions of the world before the flood were very, very different than they are today. Some of the things that lead us to believe that is you find jungle vegetation in Antarctica. You ever heard about that? They drill down, they do their ice core samples, and I mean the ice is miles and miles thick in Antarctica, but when they get down to the bedrock, they actually find vegetation that would belong in a jungle. And so what they say is, well, Pangea, over 200 million years, what used to be jungle slowly shifted down there? Well, I don't necessarily think that has to be the answer. I think that it could have been that the world looked a lot different. I mean, we find all kinds of vegetation in places that it shouldn't have been according to the way the world is today. So what if before the flood, the world was more of like a greenhouse environment? And there's actually studies that show that at one time in world history, the world was much more like a greenhouse, and you would not have had ice except on the extreme poles, and the temperate would have gone way up north, and then the jungle environment, the rainforest and such, would have been at a much higher elevations as well, or not elevations, altitude. Is that the right word? Where am I going for? Further north and south. There we go. Latitude, thank you. Again, that geography class did me no good. None. It actually did help in some ways. So you have this planet that looks completely different. The atmosphere is completely different. And many modern scientists would agree with this whether they believe in the Bible or not, but they say it's millions and millions and millions and millions of years ago, the Jurassic or the Cenozoic or all these epochs or ages that have happened long ago. But then you have this cataclysmic event that causes the entire shape of the world to be transformed. Mountains are rising, valleys are coming down, and you have this flood of water into the atmosphere, and it changes things. And what once was this warm, luscious, thriving environment becomes harsh, becomes difficult. You've got volcanoes that are spewing ash into the atmosphere. You've got all of these things, and all of a sudden, the temperature of the earth goes from this very mild place to plummets. And the entire temperature of the planet was reduced by like 10, 15, 20 degrees. And an ice age sets in. Well, Pastor Tanner, come on. You're telling me that you believe that within the last few thousand years, and by the way, I am a young earth guy. Now, that might just make you write me off as a complete idiot, but I think that there's a tremendous amount of evidence for that. But if the earth is millions and millions of years old, I don't really care. It can be as old as it wants to be. God's eternal. I don't really care how old it is. But I don't believe that everything else that goes with that. So all of a sudden, you have the world, parts of the world becoming cold very, very quickly. Now, is there any evidence of that? There actually is. Have you guys ever seen the movie Day After Tomorrow? You guys ever seen that? Fantastic movie. It's actually a movie based on good observation, but it's trying to skew it toward global warming, and it's saying global warming will eventually cause this. If you believe that, that's up to you. I don't really know all the facts. I think there's interesting evidence for and against global warming. But they find woolly mammoths. You guys know what a woolly mammoth is? It's like an elephant with a thick coat on. They find woolly mammoths flash frozen with half-eaten vegetation still undigested in their stomachs. The only way for that to happen is if the temperature goes from normal to below 145 degrees negative Fahrenheit within moments. They know this. They understand this. They know that the only way to have flash-frozen woolly mammoths with undigested vegetation in their stomach is that at some point in history, things had to go from temperate to below freezing, like hundreds of degrees below freezing in a moment. Well, I have a mechanism that can explain that. I believe the flood was responsible. All right, it's 11:30. You guys bored? All right, do you guys want to get into the big one that everybody always wants to ask about? What do you think I'm going to talk about? Dinosaurs. All right, Pastor Tanner, everybody knows that dinosaurs lived 65 million years ago, right? You know this. You know that 65 million years ago, an asteroid came and struck the Yucatan Peninsula and destroyed all dinosaurs, and only small mammals survived, which eventually took over the planet and evolved into the Australopithecines. And then the Australopithecines, over 4.4 million years, diverged between the primates and humanoids, and that's how we became today. We know this, right? You've read it in every children's dinosaur book you've ever read. Almost every dinosaur book I ever read as a kid started out 65 million years ago, right? That's what it says. I don't buy it.
You know why I don't buy it? A couple of reasons. The term dinosaur simply means terrible lizard. Dinosaurs were discovered in the 1840s, which I think is hilarious. It's kind of like Columbus discovered North America. There were already people living here. Like they knew it was there, right? But we discovered dinosaurs in the mid-1800s, and they recognized what they were, that they were these large reptilian creatures that were the size of buses, and they were terrible in size. They were terrible lizard, dinosaur. And they just decided that because of the rock layer that they were in, the strata that they were found in, again, uniformitarian geology, circular reasoning, that they were either 65 or 75 or 100 or whatever millions years old. But I have a problem with this. You see, all over the planet, and you can research this. In fact, I want you to get the video from me teaching today that's going to be on Facebook tomorrow, and I want you to dissect it, and I want you to go and look up everything that I'm talking about, and then we can argue about it, because I love that. But all over the world, cultures have drawn dinosaurs. In fact, if you go down to Peru, there are hundreds and hundreds of rocks with painted stegosauruses, brontosauruses, plesiosauruses all over the place. I mean, they have perfect depictions of what a stegosaurus and triceratops look like. So answer me this. If dinosaurs died 65 million years before human beings existed, then why do you find pictures of dinosaurs on Nebuchadnezzar's temple? Babylon, the Babylonian Gate, has depictions of what we would consider to be something like a long-necked dinosaur. How in the world could someone draw an accurate drawing of a Triceratops or a Stegosaurus if a human being had never seen one? How is that possible? Carl Baugh down in southern Texas, they actually have a place down there in a riverbed that they have uncovered that has dinosaur footprints and human footprints side by side. How does that happen if 65 million years separated us? Now you might think, well, the Bible doesn't talk about dinosaurs. It actually kind of does. The Bible talks about a creature named Behemoth. And it says that the behemoth has these ribs that are like these huge steel iron bars. And then my favorite part is that it says that it has a tail like the trunk of a mighty cedar tree. Do you know how modern theologians have interpreted that? An elephant or a hippopotamus. You ever seen an elephant tail? Big old animal, little bitty tail. That's got to be so embarrassing for his friends, right? I mean, it's like, what in the world is that even on there for? It's just like this little hanging out. That's not what the Bible is talking about. It also talks about the Leviathan, this ancient sea creature that was the terror of everything around it. Huh? The Loch Ness Monster. Well, actually, how many of you guys have heard of Nessie? Now, you might be really rolling your eyes here, right? Did you know that the Loch Ness Monster is only one of about 500 similar types of animals that have been reportedly spotted over the last hundreds of years? Like within the last 100 years all over the world? Plesiosaurus. The description of Loch Ness Monster perfectly fits a plesiosaurus that supposedly died 110 million years ago. So where do dinosaurs fit? Pastor Tanner, do you really believe dinosaurs were on the ark? Yeah, I do. I really do. But again, would you take a full-grown dinosaur? Because they're big. Or would you take a baby? Because you know what a dinosaur is? A dinosaur is a lizard that grows its entire life. Reptiles never stop growing. So the historical data that we gather from the scriptures is that before the flood, human beings lived for much longer periods of time. Noah lived to be 950 years old. Now you might roll your eyes at that, but my question to you would be, why are you rolling your eyes at that? Are you rolling your eyes at that because people don't live that long now? Are you basing everything on what you see now and assuming that the past was the same? Because that's not very good science to me. It's a good observation of the way things are now, but to extrapolate that into a conclusion that everything must have always been that way is dangerous. So if humans were living 9 to 10 times as long, who's to say that animals weren't also living longer? We know that vegetation was growing much, much bigger. So if you take a reptile which grows its entire life, you expand its lifespan, you give it 50% more oxygen to be able to grow larger and stronger, and you also give it plentiful vegetation with very, very few predators to kill it, you know what it's going to do? It's going to become the size of a bus. After the flood, human beings were still interacting with dinosaurs. You know what they called them? Dragons. Every culture in the world has stories of dragons. Now, do I think every dinosaur breathed fire and spoke like the one from Beowulf? No, I don't. I think humans have embellished some of the stories. But I think it's too much of a coincidence that every culture has the same stories of these giant reptiles. So what happened to them? Well, number one, the environment changed. 50% more oxygen meant that no animal could grow to the size that they used to be. In fact, if you take a Brontosaurus and you brought it into current day today at their current sizes, just breathing would catch it to catch on fire from the friction going through its nostrils. The nostrils of a Brontosaurus are too small for them to breathe the necessary oxygen to survive. So we know that oxygen was richer at some point in the past. So what happens is that some of the larger dinosaurs just die off from extinction because they can no longer grow to maturity to where they need to reproduce, and they die off, and then the vast majority of the other ones, they go extinct. Can you think of any other animals that have gone extinct in our lifetimes because humans have hunted them? I mean, does this seem like something that is out of question, that human beings would be like, oh, that's a really big lizard, we should kill it? Like, we do that to lions. We kill elephants. We kill animals for no other reason, especially if they're aggressive, if they're violent, or if we're having to share territory. Human beings don't do well with other animals. Have you noticed this? I mean, in Rock Island, I think squirrels are like the most evolved animals in Rock Island because they are everywhere, right? We will never starve in Rock Island because there are squirrels, rabbits, and deer everywhere here. They have figured out how to evolve beyond human beings. They live everywhere. All right, we got to close this. We're 20 till 12. The reason that I'm doing this series is because I want you to see that when you walk into the church doors, you don't have to check your brain at the door. You are not alone. If you choose to believe by faith that the Bible really is God's word and it really is a real document, it has historical fact in it, you don't have to leave your brain at the door. You may not be able to explain everything that you believe, but nobody can. Just because some people will confidently share a theory with you and tell you that it's truth does not mean it's truth. The difference between us and them is that we accept that what we believe is in faith. And that we do rely on miracles. Let's pray. Father, your word says that we will know the truth and the truth will set us free. I pray that you would help us to be open, at least open, to exploring the truth. Let us not be convinced of things without looking into them for ourselves. Lord, you commended the Bereans in the book of Acts because they studied things out for themselves to discover whether or not they were accurate. Lord, I ask you that you would help us to have that same spirit and attitude of the Bereans, not only in regards to the scriptures, but in regards to all these things, because these are things that really do matter. These are belief systems that will truly affect everything else in our lives. Because if we just throw away the stories of the Bible, then the next step is whether or not you're really true. And if you're not really true, then we can just do whatever we want. But that's not a good thing, because we know that human beings left to themselves are not good. Father, I pray that you would help us to learn the truth, to develop revelation, and to seek it out. And help us, Lord, to constantly be seeking out truth. Let us not become arrogant in our beliefs and look down on people that don't believe in you. Let us do everything well-reasoned and well-learned and well-researched with gentleness and respect, and most of all with love. Let us not get into vain arguments, but Lord, when people are truly interested, help us to be able to present them with the truth. And I pray, Lord, that above all things, that whether we believe the earth is 6,000 years old or 4.6 billion, whether or not we believe in the gap theory, or we believe in the day-age theory, or we believe that dinosaurs lived with humans or not, let us be unified around the truth of Christ. That Jesus lived a perfect life, died on the cross as a substitution for our sins, and rose victoriously from the dead. Everything else is secondary to that truth. Let us be unified in love. Let us not argue and bicker, but let us be open to discussion and good conversation. In Jesus' name.